Okay, I think we'll get started now. Welcome, everybody. On behalf of Stanford's Master of Liberal Arts program, I'm delighted to bring so many of you together here to hear such an important and timely talk. I'm Linda Paulson, the Associate Dean and Director of the MLA program here at Stanford. And many years ago, Jonathan Metzl, who was then both a resident at Stanford Hospital and an MLA student, was one of my students. I'm honored and very happy to introduce you to Jonathan M. Metzl, who is the Frederick B. ��𝘪𝘠𝘯𝘨 II Professor of Sociology and Psychiatry at Vanderbilt University and Director of its Center for Medicine, Health, and Society. Jonathan's education is certainly a model of interdisciplinary thought and action, as some of you will know from reading the book and others from hearing him tonight. Jonathan received 2 bachelor's degrees, one in biology and one in English, from the University of Missouri in Kansas City, where he also received his medical degree. During his residency in psychiatry at Stanford, he got his MLA degree, writing a thesis on the poetics of repetition in mental illness. While a practicing psychiatrist, he earned his PhD in American Studies at the University of Michigan. And shortly thereafter, he joined their faculty, where he served as the Director of Interdisciplinary Studies, as a member of the Faculty of Psychiatry, as a part of the Women's Studies program, and as Director of the program in Culture, Health, and Medicine. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2006. Now, Jonathan is certainly one of our most illustrious MLA graduates. He's the author of several books on psychiatry, sociology, and public health. And the most recent one is the subject that he'll be addressing tonight, Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. Dying of Whiteness is the 2020 recipient of the prestigious Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, given each year to the book that, in the words of Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., most faithfully and forcefully reflects Robert Kennedy's purposes, his concern for the poor and the powerless, his struggle for honest and even-handed justice, his conviction that a decent society must assure all young people a fair chance, and his faith that a free democracy can act to remedy disparities of power and opportunity. Now, those of you who have read Dying of Whiteness, and those of you who will perhaps begin to read it or listen to it tomorrow, will know how precisely this honor's intention was fulfilled in Jonathan Metzl's book. I know that he's taking precious time away from his engagement in the current election, as are all of you, and I'm especially grateful that Jonathan found the time to talk to us tonight. A few small housekeeping points. We'll be using the Q&A feature tonight. We're also recording this hour. We'll do our best to get to your questions, but also to be respectful of your time tonight. And now I'm going to hand the screen over to Jonathan Metzl. It seems like there ought to be applause, but that's a little hard to do. I'll applaud myself. So Jonathan, please.
Listen, I am just so honored to be giving this talk tonight. It's been, interesting year for all of us, and I really wish I was there with everybody. But I just want to say how incredibly honored I am to be speaking with you, because I really feel like everything that Linda just mentioned, I really owe to the continuing studies program. I was somebody who was in medicine, in residency, but kind of trying to figure out how I could put together all these crazy interests that I had in culture and society and medicine. And then I wandered over one day and found the program and ended up spending some time speaking to Marsh McCall and then to Linda and other people. And it really honestly changed my entire life. It wasn't just a terrific interactive interdisciplinary program, but it changed my idea of what was possible with my career and what you could do with different disciplines. And so first, just honestly, this is really truly an honor for me to just give back a little bit, because so much of what I do reflects the skills that I got at Stanford and that I've built on. Now, I've had a kind of interesting couple of years here. The book just came out a while ago, a year ago, and and really, I wrote the book as a warning. I mean, it's a book, as you'll hear in a minute, I'm somebody, I grew up in Kansas City. I live in Tennessee now, although I'm speaking to you from the East Coast. And I really wrote it basically saying there's this terrible storm brewing in red state America. And it really was kind of a warning that we should turn back because these horrible health policies are really pernicious. And instead what happened is, as we've seen, they become national policies. And it really has been a moment over the course of the pandemic where there were all of these moments where we could have and should have come together as a nation. And instead, what we're seeing is a president attacking the only national health care plan that is available to him at a time when people are losing their jobs and need health care, and when people need to be able to see the doctor. And this really dates back to the very beginning of the pandemic, when in March and April, half the country, because many red states didn't expand under the Affordable Care Act, many people didn't have access to healthcare. And that was a moment where a real leader would have stepped up and said, look, we're going to expand Medicaid for everybody so that we're all protected and we don't have the kind of economic catastrophe we're seeing. But that didn't happen. And for me, it was an amplification of a lot of the stuff that I'd seen in writing the book. And so really the book was a kind of 5-year analysis of this story at a state level. And really the story is the health effects of undermining public trust in institutions and infrastructures, really in ways that influence everyone. And there are a lot of different reasons why that happened. But for me, one of the main ones was just a breakdown in trust in government, in infrastructure, in shared community, and the fact that we could all imagine shared futures within the same infrastructure. And there are a lot of reasons that happened, but for me, it's really all goes back. I'm a scholar of race and health, and it goes back to these kind of racial tensions, racial divisions, unhealed racial wounds that really become dividing lines that are exploited in everyday life, in aggressions and microaggressions, but they're particularly exploited in moments of crisis like a pandemic. And so I don't know, I have a lot to say about growing up in Kansas City. I grew up in Kansas City where I had seen Kansas City do a lot better. It's a city that really had a spirit of people getting along. And then the NRA took over, the Tea Party took over, and my parents still live in Kansas City. Every time I'd go back, I would just see the advent of these very divisive politics. And it really changed the public sphere. It changed the way people interacted with each other. And then after that, I was at University of Michigan. I was at NYU for a while. Then I moved to Tennessee to direct the Center for Medicine, Medicine, Health, and Society. And really, all these experiences really hit home for me in Tennessee. Now, I moved to Tennessee in 2010, 2011. And it was a pretty interesting year to be moving to Tennessee because it was the year that this thing called the Affordable Care Act was coming down the pike. For people who don't remember the history, it seems like ancient history, but now in this pandemic, like this morning feels like ancient history. But in 2010, it was a period where, if people remember, the Democratic Congress had passed the Affordable Care Act, saying we really need national health insurance plan. Senate had approved it, President had signed it, and then it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically said, yes, we have the right as a country to have a national health care plan, but there was a kind of poison pill in the Supreme Court's ruling at the time, nothing like what we're about to get. But at the time, what they said is every state has its own right to decide whether or not it's going to expand Medicaid and whether or not it's going to create a competitive insurance network where there's competition to lower premiums. And so every state was really debating how to address the Affordable Care Act on its own terms. And that was a pretty interesting time because Tennessee really needed that. I mean, Tennessee was a state that, because of the failure of a program called TennCare, had worsening health over the time period of really when this was coming about. And so over the decade leading up to the Affordable Care Act, rising chronic illnesses, expensive illnesses, community-based illnesses, everything from obesity, addiction, deaths of despair, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, infant mortality, all these things were getting worse in Tennessee. And part of the reason it was getting worse was, number one, Tennessee had a program called TennCare, which it tried to pay for, but it couldn't. So it's the only state healthcare network that it had was falling apart, and it was falling apart because it was too expensive. And that meant that a lot of people were just falling out of, a lot of people didn't have access to doctors, and also community health was very bad. And so really there was a crisis in Tennessee in the years leading up to the Affordable Care Act, where Tennessee was falling to the bottom 10, often 5 in number of states, in terms of health outcomes, and really honestly preventable health outcomes, things like obesity, hypertension, stroke, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all these things that are tied not just to chronic illness, but also to community illness. And then along the way comes this thing called the Affordable Care Act. And again, this is 2010, 2011, and just look at these graphs, what's happening in Tennessee. The health is getting worse, and the system's going bankrupt. And here comes this thing called the Affordable Care Act. Now, the Affordable Care Act now means something very different. I think of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, 2011 as being almost like, Atari Pong or iPhone 1.0, like some kind of technology that was a starter technology, but nobody thought it was going to be the final thing. They thought that we're going to put it out in the world and we're going to see how people use it. And through user interface, we're going to improve this system for people. And it was never meant to be the final thing. It ended up being the final thing because the GOP never let it improve. But even in the initial Affordable Care Act, look at all this great stuff. It had free preventative care, which is awesome if you're in a state like Tennessee, because we ain't got no preventative care. Prevention and public health. Well, think of all those illnesses, those very costly illnesses that could be alleviated with prevention and public health interventions, which would get out in the community and help prevent these illnesses before they show up in the emergency room and cost the system a lot of money, and also cost people their lives. New consumer protections for individuals and families. And that's important because as the state system in Tennessee had started to fail, people were getting kicked off the rolls. And so this, in a way, was a perfect system. And the best part of this is the state wasn't going to have to pay for it. It was a federal system that was going to really help also the financial system. And so in a way, if you just think about this, if you just landed from Mars or something like that, that in a way, this program was in a way like manna from heaven for people like Tennessee. It was exactly a system that should have and could have and should have passed, but that wasn't what happened. Around this time, a couple of colleagues of mine and I from Vanderbilt started doing focus groups around Tennessee, and we started asking people, how do you feel about the Affordable Care Act? And we asked wealthy men and women. I'm just going to talk about the men groups tonight. We asked middle income men and women, and we asked low income men and women, although again, I'll just talk about the men. How do you feel about this thing coming down the pike called the Affordable Care Act? Now, the groups I'm going to tell you about tonight were at these low income housing communities that were in kind of rural Tennessee. They were really, in some ways, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And men would show up in these housing communities really after they had fallen through the cracks of society. It's very hard to get into these housing communities because there's just not a great safety net in Tennessee. But the kind of average story that we would hear when we would talk to men was something like, I had a really good, successful thing going there. I was a manager of a restaurant, or I owned a car company. My life was going pretty well. I drove a cab. I could pay my taxes. And then one day, I saw blood in my urine, or one day I had a bloody cough, or I felt a pain in my liver. And that was the sign of a chronic illness. And in a state like Tennessee, where there's no safety net and there was no protection for pre-existing conditions, a chronic illness really became an economic and medical death sentence for many people. And so they would fall through the cracks. And the lucky ones ended up at these low-income housing communities. And so the issue is really that part of the story we heard when we talked to men, and we would divide the groups into groups of 10 or 15 men based on self-identified race. And these aren't the actual men. These are stock images because of HIPAA. I can't show you, but the men kind of looked like this, and it kind of felt like this. And part of the story we would hear were just stories of remarkable bravery because, it's hard. It's hard to get into a housing community like this, and you have to really work the system, and the system is not set up for you to succeed. It's set up for you to fall through the cracks. And so part of what we heard were just these stories of remarkable bravery. But there was another story that had a lot to do with race. Now, it's pretty interesting when you run a focus group. You get about 10, 12 people around, and the first 10 or 15 minutes are just kind of icebreaker questions. And so what happened was, the first 10 or 15 minutes, we'd say stuff like, what do you do to stay healthy? Or what does health mean to you? Or, what are the factors that dictate your health? And the men, it didn't matter if they were rich or poor or middle income, middle managers, whatever, every man kind of sounded the same pretty much. They would basically say stuff like, man, I got this spare tire and I'm trying to lose it. The wife really wants me to lose it. And I'm trying to walk every day. And then I'm walking down the street and dang, if I don't see that the McRib is on sale for 99 cents. And dang, if I don't want me some McRib. And like everybody in the group would laugh because, dang, we all wanted some McRib at that very moment. It sounded pretty good. So the first 15, 20 minutes were just kind of, let's talk about health in a very general way. And then about 15, 20 minutes into it, we'd get a little bit complicated. And we would say, okay, now we're going to be talking about healthcare reform. We didn't say Obamacare. We didn't say Affordable Care Act. We said healthcare reform. And we asked a kind of deceptively complex question. We said, who benefits from healthcare reform? We didn't say, how do you feel about it? We said, who do you think benefits? And here's where the racial differences in answers really came out. When we asked this question to African-American men, we would get responses like this. I think society does. I think society does. And then it keeps people having insurance. It keeps costs down for everyone. Or yeah, because people are healthy, because of checkups and things like that. So I think everyone as a society do, I think we all do by having people insured. Or someone has to protect the citizenship, not just Black people, but protect us as a country. And I just find these, even to this day, to be remarkable answers for a number of reasons. One is these are poor Black men in the South who have not been treated well by the system. And I think for all the world, you would think men would say, we want a system that is going to just work for us. But that's not what they said. They said, we want a system that's going to work for everyone. And so in some ways, I just think that the generosity of these answers is really, really remarkable. And the other issue that I think is important is this is exactly the attitude that you want people to have when you're creating a national healthcare system. You want them to say, let's bring everybody to the party, because then you can democratize cost. And so if one person has a broken finger and another person has a kidney transplant, you can pay for it because everybody's in the system. Unfortunately, that wasn't what we heard when we talked to white men. When we asked working class or lower income white men, very often we'd hear answers like this. Who benefits from healthcare reform? I'm 53, I've had 2 heart attacks, I have a chronic cough, I'm fat, my diet sucks, I work 12 hours a day flipping burgers, I come back to my room, eat junk food, watch TV and fall asleep. I'm a ticking time bomb health-wise, I got high blood pressure bad just like my dad did and he died young. And I'd say, well, who benefits from healthcare reform? And he'd say, I ain't supporting Obamacare, no way, no how, I ain't signing up for it neither. And I'd say, well, why is that? And he'd say, ain't no way I want my tax dollars helping Mexicans or welfare claims. Now, imagine this scenario. Here's a guy who's like literally on death's doorstep. And over the 3 years of the focus groups, a number of the men did pass away that we were interviewing. So here's somebody who's really medically sick and in need. And instead of saying, yeah, give me the healthcare, what he said was, I'm not going to sign up for a system that might help me, but it's going to be gamed by these undeserving others, these racial others. And we just heard that again and again. A lot of people use this Obamacare. There's a lot of people that not sick, they go to 2 or 3 doctors. They just use the shit out of it. And when somebody needs it, it ain't there for you to get. A lot of people on welfare. I'm not saying everybody, but people have 10 or 12 kids. There ought to be a cutoff some point. It's generation after generation. I'm just saying they're using it up. It's about time somebody did something or it's not going to be there for everybody. And so even from these answers, I think you can see another one. What really pisses Americans off is that we're pocketing, we are pocketing all the Mexicans, all the illegal mother truckers, their houses, their food stamps, everything they want, we're paying for it. And so this this really became the story of the book. Here were men who were dying. And I really ask in the book, what were these men dying of? And I answer that question in two ways. On one hand, they're dying of real illness. They're dying of untreated medical illness in ways that shouldn't happen in a country with the resources of the United States. They were dying of heart failure, liver failure, lung failure, addiction, poverty, things that really, shouldn't be happening in a country like ours. And when you see really untreated chronic illness, it's really quite graphic. It's really quite alarming. And so part of what they were dying is something that's really not very socially constructed. It's what happens to the body when the body doesn't get medical care. But on the other hand, they were dying of an ideology. And I think hopefully you could see that from those quotes. They were dying of an ideology that told them that there were privileges that were due to them as white Americans. I think importantly, those privileges were due to them and not due to other groups of people. So they continually felt that minorities and immigrants were out to usurp their resources, kind of keep them down. Again and again, they would say that we are paying for it. And the we that they were talking about was not really we in a tax sense, because a lot of these men were quite destitute. They really weren't paying tax. So what they meant by we is we white Americans. It was that kind of debt, that kind of wage. And obviously there's a lot of racism. And I think the most important point is that it wasn't just 12 men in a room telling me that. In fact, what these 12 men were telling me was mirrored in the entire state, because year in and year out, when the Affordable Care Act would go up for the ballot, a state ballot, the politicians who were elected were the ones who basically said, we're not going to expand Medicaid so that those other undeserving racial others aren't going to get it. And so in a way, what we heard in these rooms were reflective of the larger politics of the state. And that really became the story of the book. I do a lot of comparison analysis. And really, the question is, what does this cost people? I do a lot of research that shows that, Latinx and African-American communities really suffered because they never got healthcare. They didn't get healthcare, particularly in Tennessee. Kentucky next door did expand and health outcomes actually improved. But the biggest victims of this ridiculous, just basically giving away free healthcare, were actually white people. And so what Tennessee is a state that's about 80% white. And I have tons of data in the book that just shows the impact of people in Tennessee. Don't even worry about the graphs. People in Tennessee, white people in Tennessee paid more for their prescription medications. They didn't go to the doctor. They gave up on regular medical checkups. They had many more medical bankruptcies than people in Kentucky next door. And ultimately, I quantify it. And what you see is falling lifespans for white people in Tennessee. And so the story is kind of like, what's the cost of trading in this whiteness, trading in this idea that what it means to be white is to be blocking other people. Now, of course, that's a story that's kind of as old as our country, unfortunately. And certainly, for me, the best narrator of this story is Du Bois, who writes about a wage of whiteness in his book about Black Reconstruction. And basically, that's a book about kind of a moment like right now, a moment after the Civil War, where Du Bois is asking, look, here are all these really poor white people and all these really poor Black people, and why don't they get together and form common cause socioeconomically? And Du Bois says it's the very idea of what it means to be white, this psychological wage that prevents white people from doing things that are in their own interests. And that really becomes the story of the book. I track this wage of whiteness really across a bunch of different states, and just show the negative health effects of this idea of what it means to be white, shortening white lifespans, and really what happens when that idea of a hierarchical notion of race works its way into health policy. So I spend a lot of time in Missouri in a very different climate, looking at guns, the story of guns. I look at how guns are constructed and sold, dramatically expanded as symbols of kind of a restoration of white masculinity. And so a lot of kind of make white men great again. So I looked at all these ads. I did all these focus groups talking about, white men in particular, talking about how guns gave them their power back, and certainly a lot of that. I spent a lot of time with gun owners. I went on open carry marches. I did focus groups with gun owners talking about their guns. And what I heard again and again is, I would say, like, a lot of these guys had like 30 or 40 weapons. And I'd say, why do you need so many weapons? And it wasn't like, I'm hunting turkey for dinner or something. It was, well, Black people are going to carjack me, and that's why I need these guns. Or there's so much black on black crime. There's all these looters. There's all these, rioters, all these things. So I need this to protect myself. And I did a lot of data analysis in Missouri as well. And what I found was there was a slight rise in black on black crime as guns really, I look at starting in 2008, when guns really started to become much more prevalent. But the biggest victims of gun death in Missouri were white men. And that's because 80% of gun death in Missouri turned out to be gun suicide. And of that, 90% turned out to be white men. And so there were about 29 more black on black shootings that led to death in the years that I looked at every year. But there were about 400 gun suicides a year. And so really the biggest victims of this were these guys. And that makes sense when you think about it, because at a moment of despair, the biggest risk factor for gun suicide is having a gun around. And so really the question was this worth this? And that was another trade-off. And then the last part of the book, very different. I go to Kansas, and I just look at massive cuts to education brought about by the Sam Brownback administration. Kansas really had a very successful run of it after the Brown versus Board of Education, creating a very functioning state public school system that everyone benefited from. And then they started these budget cuts to schools. And I did a lot of, again, on the ground interviews, talking to people about what, I would interview moms who their own schools were getting, the budgets were getting eviscerated at their own kids' schools. And a lot of people told me, this is horrible. We can't let this happen. But again, just like in Tennessee, I heard a lot of stories about basically these undeserving Black people are taking these resources that are our tax dollars. Again and again, they would tell me, like, these Black districts are renting party buses and taking it, and it turned out to be a total myth. And again, what I do is I just track it. And certainly Black and brown populations suffered a lot. 4th, 8th, 11th grade reading, math, science scores all went down. But the biggest victims of this crazy policy of cutting your own school system were white people, because Kansas is about an 80% white state. And so they saw the biggest drops in graduation rates. And again, what happened was it quantified into a dramatic loss of revenue, vibrancy, life expectancy, because if you drop out of high school, you have a shorter lifespan for the state. And so in sum, I would just say a few things before getting to the questions. And one is really just that we're all connected. I mean, there's a fantasy that you can create a healthcare system or an education system that just works for your group and not for some other group. But that ain't how it works. Either we're going to build healthcare systems that help everybody, or as we see with this pandemic, we're all going to go down the drain together. And so this fantasy that you can create a healthcare network just for you, it doesn't work. And I can explain in the end why it doesn't work. Another lesson for me that was, I thought, pretty important was that it really takes a long time to build up infrastructure. So I looked at Kansas. It was about a 60 or 70 year period. Every year they would just squirrel away $5, $10, whatever it took. And every year the schools would get a little bit better. Over half a century, it really took 50, 60 years. But then the minute they started destroying the budgets, it took about 2 years to destroy the whole thing. And so it's really easy to destroy things. It's very hard to build them. We really have a lot of work ahead of us. Man, don't even get me started. A lot of the stuff I'm talking about is really at risk right now, and I understand that. And part of the reason it's at risk is because the issues like healthcare and guns, they've really stopped being about the issues themselves. They've really been constructed as identity issues. Owning a gun for part of the country really comes to define what it means to be white. The guy gave me a Christmas card when I was interviewing him. This is his family. It's kind of dad and mom and little son, all with their semi-automatic weapons around the Christmas tree. And really, that we're not talking about guns here. We're talking about identity. And so part of the issue is, how do you work back from that? But there are structural models, like in Kentucky, where people are, using structure to create more equity, which I think is really the path back for us, and really have different conversations about whiteness, work away from this whiteness idea that we're under attack, that we're the victims, and really work toward more equitable, horizontal versions of what it means to be white that are much more egalitarian and much less obsessed with having to stay up top of an imaginary hierarchy. And really that's the issue for the rest, for after the election, is really we need to figure out new ways of not just talking about race, talking about whiteness, talking about collaboration, and really trying to figure out if we can imagine a shared future together after this election, or to use Steve King's tweet from last year, we're headed into some pretty tough territory. So I will stop there and welcome any questions people might have. But again, it's just really been an honor to bring my work back to where it all started.
Thank you, Jonathan. I've got a question here from the Q&A. Growing up in the Midwest must have given you access that a coastal person might not have had. Were you met with initial suspicion or hesitancy when you did your interviews and held your group sessions?
Well, it's funny, like it's kind of like I have many different homes, and certainly I consider myself somebody who grew up in Missouri, but I also grew up Jewish in Missouri, so I was always kind of an insider outsider. But I would say that I'm very comfortable in the Midwest. I grew up with a lot of people who are quite conservative, people who are gun owners, so it didn't really seem that foreign to me. And I see that a lot of times when social scientists go into places where they just, really don't kind of click into it. So part of the issue is these all felt like people I kind of went to camp with, or whatever, and it didn't feel that foreign. And I feel like part of the issue is, I feel a little frustration because there are a lot of great things about the Midwest and the purple states and stuff, and there's a sense of community if you're an insider. There is some generosity among certain people. There's there's some other things. And so in a way, if you just meet people on Twitter, you never get that nuance, right? We're only interacting with each other on social media. And so I do think there's a power of going to talk to people that it is larger than whether or not you grew up there. It's just that we're more complicated as beings than, fighting with each other on Twitter, which is what Twitter thrives for. But I would also say it's because I'm a white person and I was talking to other white people. And I think that certainly it would have been a different experience if that wasn't the case. So in a way, it was also a conversation about whiteness that was, I think, obviously a little bit easier also because of my racial identity. And so I think it was all of those things. But I would also say that it does frustrate me because I also think that it's just surprising when you actually go talk to people how people can surprise you also. And so I think that it's hard. We're social distanced and we're polarized, and we don't actually have a venue for those conversations.
Let's see. Have you seen any fundamental attitude changes in the last 10 years in Tennessee?
It's funny because everybody seems to think like, oh, when they just see this, they're going to change their mind to our side. Everybody on all sides thinks that. Right now, I play a lot of softball, and I'm the only non-Trump supporter on my softball team in Tennessee, and all these guys are like, how aren't you voting for Trump after you've seen the Hunter Biden thing? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Everybody's convinced that when the other side sees something, they're going to see the light. But the interesting part partially is how much these attitudes become hardened, right? As they become identities. And so there's not going to be any number of pandemic deaths that are going to lead people to support the Affordable Care Act, which is unfortunately, I think, going to get overturned by the Supreme Court. And so in a way, the attitude shifts are toward more polarization. I think they're toward more hardening of positions on both sides. Certainly that's true about guns. If you 10 years ago would have told people that you can walk into a bar with a loaded gun in Tennessee, they would think you were nuts. But now everybody supports that. That's just the way things are. And so I think really the issue is, how did we get so extreme? How did we get to the point where we're so polarized? I just had a piece in the Boston Review about this the other day. And part of the argument I made is, it's a mistake to think that that's just about people's attitudes, that there actually are structural drivers. There are bigger forces that are forcing these polarization. There's so much disinformation, There's dark money in politics. We have a political system that actually is completely antithetical to compromise. There's actually no reward for compromise in our political system. We have a political system where the entire electorate, the outcome of the election depends on white swing voters and swing states. And so the whole system is geared toward rewarding polarization. And so part of the issue is, can we change people's minds? And that's important, common conversations. But I also think until we kind of communally take aim at the structural drivers of polarization, that I think these conversations are just going to get more extreme. And so unfortunately for me, the answer in Tennessee is that I think that honestly things have gotten worse. There's less dialogue.
Were low-income women just as prone to making racist criticisms of social welfare systems as the men were? That is, to what degree was sexism or toxic masculinity factoring into the patterns that you identify?
I think in healthcare, they were just really good about, I mean, it's funny, but people like if you would have told anybody in this country a year ago that there's something that you can buy pretty much for 99 cents on Amazon, that you just cover your mouth and you would save how many lives? A couple 100,000 lives. Everybody would be like, cool. And it's non-invasive, and you don't need health insurance for it. People would have been fine. And the first months of the pandemic, nobody cared about a mask, really. Who cared? Big deal. And then this machine took over, and the machine was this thing is evil. It's the government. It's whatever. And that script spread like wildfire. I saw it in our focus groups, men and women, where initially people were like, cool, like I never had healthcare before. Now I'm going to get it. Everybody said that. And then when the machine took over and told them, ooh, Black people are gaming you, all of a sudden they were against it. And so the men and the women were pretty much saying the same thing. And I think that's important because, of course, the women very often are the caregivers in the family, in Southern family units, and also kind of the supporters of deciding about medical decision making and things like that in the South. And so the fact that they got to the women with this narrative, I thought was pretty remarkable. But it just showed me the power of it. And that was certainly true in the gun part too. I talked to a lot of women in the gun part, and they were just as pro-gun as the men were. A lot of women, and I mean, it was deep. Like, I mean, I was doing focus groups on gun suicide where women had lost their husbands to gun suicide, parents had lost their children to accidental shooting, and they would tell me, we don't blame the gun. It's never the gun's fault. The gun is who we are. And so, in a way, just the depth of these narratives, it's really why I said that they become identity narratives for certain people. And it makes you realize how hard it is. Like, a public health scholar is going to do a project on gun policy and then go in and tell people to do gun policy. Well, you're not going to get people to do background checks or whatever gun policy. When you're talking about identity, you really need to talk about people's identity first.
Okay, about these guns, we have someone who says, I'm interested in this idea of a gun as a new signifier of whiteness. Does this symbol belong to a large tradition of symbols like the frontier culture or self-reliance? Or is this new symbol a recent development and one correlated to racial resentment?
I'm excited for you to read the book. I have tons and tons and tons in the book about that. It's complicated, right? Because part of what I show in the book is that we have about a 300-year history of constructing guns as symbols of white privilege. Only white people could carry guns, even in pre-colonial America. If you carried a gun, you were a landowner or you were a white person who was trying to shoot, Indian revolts and all these kind of things. And that's true through the Civil War, all these kind of things. And so part of the story here is that guns have been constructed as symbols of white privilege in ways that gun manufacturers have been very conscious about in their marketing efforts. And so certainly there's a couple 100-year history that has gotten the most intense since 1985, this thing called the Heller decision in the Supreme Court, that really expanded the idea of what a militia is from an actual militia to, you are your own militia. And that tapped into a lot of ideas about whiteness, white identity, white individualism, the whole frontier thing. And I'll use a term from my medical training, is a load of crap. And the reason that is because it's totally constructed by 1950s gun culture. If you look back at actual frontier culture, guns were really expensive and bullets were few and far between because they had to make your own bullets. And so there wasn't like big old shootout at 𝘂𝘪𝘭𝘪𝘆, none of that stuff. There may be a few shots fired, but for the most part, people didn't have guns to do that kind of stuff. And so it really was kind of this new NRA and the John Wayne culture and stuff that kind of co-opted it to sell guns. Now, we're at an interesting moment now because among the other wonderful things that this new great Supreme Court's going to do is they're going to expand the Heller decision. And the important note is that the NRA, it's not a gun owners organization. It's a gun manufacturers organization. And so their goal is not to maintain white privilege. Their goal is to sell guns. And so they really want everybody to be owning and buying guns. They want guns in New York. They want guns in San Francisco. They want guns in LA. These are like the holy grail of markets, because the minute, this group gets a gun in New York, the other group, and blah, blah, blah. So in a way, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because it's really like a golden season for gun manufacturers now. They can become arms dealers in their own country, and think about how great that's going to be with all the polarization and stuff. But it'll be interesting to see how these racial narratives play out. And even in the pandemic, now there are Black militias, for example, and they're being supported by white libertarian militias and Proud Boys and all these kind of things. So it'll be interesting to see how this race dynamic plays out. But I just think it's important to remember that this is being driven by an industry, just like the healthcare stuff is being driven by an industry, that they want to sell guns, and they had a great run with white people, but now they're broadening their market. And it's kind of similar with the Affordable Care Act. If you think about it, like the insurance companies lose a lot of money by covering pre-existing conditions. And so overturning the ACA is going to be great for them because they don't have to insure sick people anymore. And so all these things that seem like race, they're really about corporate America, a lot of them. And so, I think guns is a perfect example of that.
Okay, there's so many good questions. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but here are a couple that sort of fit together. How does an individual reach out to friends and acquaintances in the Midwest to have constructive conversations rather than have them devolve into animosity? And added onto that is your softball team interested in your views? I mean, it sounds funny, but it's exactly to the point.
I did a public conversation last night with a group called Millions of Conversations, where I brought in 2 guys from my softball team, libertarian gun owners who are Trump supporters. And we modeled a public conversation. I'll send it around afterwards once it goes live if you want. But, we had a really interesting conversation. I basically asked my friends to explain their views to people who, it's not disagree with you. It's like, don't understand, like, help us understand your logic, right? And then I asked them, what do you think our position is? And then I asked them, what would compromise look for you? Now, this was very particular people. It's sample bias, right? Because people who wouldn't do that wouldn't come talk to me on a public forum, just like people who wouldn't do that wouldn't talk to me in my research. But I do think that I learned a lot about kind of a mode of potentially talking across divides that has to do with the way you ask open-ended questions, which isn't like, how could you vote against your own self-interest? Like, that is a non-starter. Or what, how do you feel about gun control? How do I feel about guns? It's more like, what, if you have the conversation, what don't people understand about your position? You're aware of the trigger words. You don't want to say gun control. You don't, you want to kind of let people there. You want to say, like, what would compromise look like to you? How do you imagine my position? How do you imagine, what do you imagine? Can you articulate what you think my position is? So if you can kind of, I mean, for people in the audience who know couples therapy, those are the techniques of couples therapy. But I think that's really for me, the only way to do it is to go into it with a sense of humility. And the reason I say that is because, this framework of people voting against their own self-interest, it's just a total non-starter, right? Because they have different interests. Now, I don't agree with their interests at all, but a lot of people I interviewed said, I know I'm giving up my own health care, but I'm not an idiot. I care more that we have a Supreme Court justice who's going to overturn Roe versus Wade, and that matters to me more than anything. And so they're making decisions based on a logic for the most part. And I think it's important to understand that if you want to have a conversation, and it just makes you think about how deep polarization is, that we fall into it so easily. But again, that's not everybody. Yeah, it's got to be people who are willing to have that conversation.
Okay. Are there some specific events that help to create this racial divide? What in our society is contributing to this? We had someone suggest that, did you blame Ronald Reagan for these anti-government attitudes?
Well, certainly there was this Southern strategy, which courses through Nixon and Reagan, about using exacerbating the racial wounds, the racial resentment, the fear of loss and entitlement of white Southerners, using that as a political weapon. So we've had a good run of this for for decades, and so certainly this has been a very consciously manipulated narrative, and so I'm going to flip that question on its head a little bit and say that there are moments where we could have flipped the scripts, right? I think that's why Du Bois on Black Reconstruction is such an important book, right? Because the whole idea is, we just fought this whole Civil War, and the whole Civil War is off this idiotic idea of racial hierarchy, the idea that one race is better than another race. And all it did is kill over 1 million people in our country. And now, why don't we move on? Why don't we work together? And for a minute after the Civil War, people actually were working together. White laborers who didn't have land worked with newly freed slaves who also didn't have land. And that lasted for a couple of years. And then capitalism took over and said, no, we can't have unions, we can't have you work together. But imagine how powerful the South and the entire country would be if, in fact, people had been able to work together. If we would have created communal structures, we would have had a very different country right now if, after the Civil War, we would have taken a turn toward building communal infrastructure that would have really changed the course of things. But we didn't do that. And the pandemic is exactly the same moment, right? In a way that here's a moment where our infrastructure, our inequality is being highlighted in ways that it is killing people disproportionately. And this is a moment where, to quote, Amartya Sen, we should be building a better society. We should be building infrastructures that make us less vulnerable to future pandemics, fixing our inequities, making sure everybody has healthcare, but instead we're building more inequality. And so really, I think that's the challenge for us, is at these crisis moments, we have a moment where everybody's vulnerable. I mean, after a war, people are vulnerable. In a pandemic, everybody's vulnerable. And so these are the moments where people are willing to be led, but unfortunately, we've got some pretty big headwinds again in that regard.
Okay, this is a long one, I'll read it. Research indicates that people with lower power are better at perspective taking. Maybe that explains the African-American statements, the men's statements you read earlier, about research reform. That is, they extend their group membership to include more people. What makes white men think of their race as privilege instead of thinking of their new socioeconomic status and form an alliance with other poor people? Do you think priming them about their financial worry before talking about healthcare reform might help? Or will race always predominate?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. That's a brilliant question. They're all brilliant questions. That's fantastic. I I think part of the story is a distraction. I mean, look at how great a distractor Trump is. He's like, look over here, blah, 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 make America great, while he's enacting a GOP tax bill and bonus giveaways that just enrich people that are nobody in his base is going to get there. So part of the issue is there's a distraction. It's really powerful to do focus groups in the South with people who are getting screwed by policies that are brought in by politicians they voted for. And the reason it's so powerful is because there are people who are screwing them over, but they're not being screwed over by the people who they see coming up underneath them. They think that they're being screwed over by, you know, the rapists coming across the border and all this stuff, but no, they're being screwed over by other white people above them, and so they should be looking up. They should be getting angry at people above them. You know, every tax cut for a corporation takes away money for your roads and your bridges and your aqueducts. And the fact that they don't do that is because of the power of this distraction. This racism is used as a distraction so that people won't join and won't common cause, so that they won't look up and those kind of things. And I think that's really the message, is that it's really, how do you get people to do that? And part of this manipulation isn't just about race, it's also about scarcity. That if you can create this austerity, this feeling that there's 20 people and 10 rolls of toilet paper, then all of a sudden everybody's in a competition stage with each other. And so I think part of the way to narrate this isn't just to educate people, it's also to create a narrative that there's going to be enough for everybody. So it's actually nothing to do with race, and it has to do with this terror, which I think we all have felt during the pandemic. I mean, you know, where can we find the Purell, and where can we get a mask? I mean, these are very real moments, and people at the bottom of the socioeconomic chain are living with that all the time. And the minute you tell them somebody else is going to take this resource, it becomes like literally terrifying. And so part of the issue, I think, is how can you recast the scarcity narrative that is being manipulated? I mean, look at the pandemic. The minute the pandemic hit, Trump started out of the blue saying, they're going to take away your guns. They're going to take away your Second Amendment rights. Now, that is just a load of hoo-ha, because nobody was even talking about that. Nobody cared. Nobody was thinking about it. But the minute he started saying, they're going to take away your guns, of course, everybody ran out and bought 900 guns, because it was an idea of, oh, I better get it today because they're going to be gone tomorrow. And so this scarcity narrative, it puts people in competition, and it's manipulated. And so in a way, I think a counter narrative isn't just like, let me educate you, sir, about the Affordable Care Act. It's also like, there's going to be enough healthcare for everybody, and everybody will be taken care of. Some counter austerity narrative. I haven't worked that out quite yet, but for me, that's really got to be the answer. Is about you know, and again, I'm thinking of societies that try to figure this out. It's more like, we're gonna get through it together, something like that, if that makes sense.
Okay, time for maybe two more questions. Do you see a way that if we have a change in the White House, is there a way that a new president can find acceptance, or at least get a hearing in the Midwest? And what are the ways that you see this coming about?
Well, I think it's important to counter hack. I mean, think of all the battles we've lost. I mean, we lost masks. We lost we lost the one about the coronavirus. you know, people, half the country is for the coronavirus. And so you have to realize how we lost. I mean, it's not just about empathy. It is, but I think we have to learn the lessons of how we lost these narratives. How was it that some kind of machine, some kind of racializing machine, got people to not wear masks that would have saved their lives and their community? And so you have to learn what the structures are that manipulate that and counter hack those narratives. So it's not just about the president, it's also recognizing the mechanisms that are spreading this, and see if you can counter hack it. I mean, you know, I think that the Koch brothers should be on our side now. I think Fox News should get on our side. I think that in a way, if you can counter hack or create narratives, but you really have to change the narrative at the level of the disinformation, or we're just going to keep getting more polarized.
Okay. Let's see. Last question, I think. Do you have any thoughts on how we might overcome these obstacles as a society? Are there opportunities locally versus the national discussion? And I think I would sort of add to that, what are your hopes for this book?
I mean, this book, I'm so sorry this book is so relevant. You know, I want my next book just to be about like peonies or little puppies or something. I want a happy book. But you know, but again, we're at an existential moment for everyone right now. And I think that, you know, I hope people see this, that zero-sum formulations of winner and loser politics don't work for anybody. We end up just all being losers when it's a zero-sum formulation. And that was, that's the narrative of whiteness, but it's also the narrative of like, when we get elected, we're gonna take over and force you to do this thing, or we're gonna take over. It's so easy. It comes so naturally for people who are liberal like me to say, when we get over, we're gonna ban assault rifles and stuff like that. But you know, but there's like 900 steps that have to get there before you do that, which is like, what do assault rifles mean to people who actually own them? And so, and I think it's true to imagine collaboration. And I mean, like, this is a challenge for Democrats, like societies that actually mobilize structural change do so when parties have strong centers, places where there's collaboration between centrist conservatives and centrist liberals that can then also engage with you know, more extreme right and left wings. And so I think that there's a challenge for the Democrats, which is not that progressives or centrists are going to take over, but can they model a real collaboration between centrist and progressive Democrats in ways that isn't about the two sides fighting with each other and just getting winners and losers. So I think the number one thing is we can't have a zero-sum formulation of the Democratic Party, or that would be a disaster because it would be just too easy to make it too unstable. It's really like, if you're a Democrat, imagine what's it going to be like for progressives and centrists to form a common agenda and believe it, right? And then build outward from that. I mean, the things that we believe in, right? The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Gun Control Act in the 60s, they were all built by a center that also engaged with other parts. So I think we need a political spectrum, I think is the issue, and it's got to be vibrant. But if we think we're just going to take over and then do to them what they did to us, then I think we're just going to keep going back and forth like a ping pong. So to me, that's really the lesson, and it's a challenge, depending really on what happens on not just on Tuesday, but on on whenever we find out who wins all these elections. It's going to take a while.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for this sobering conversation and for finding the time to share this time with us. Thanks also to everybody who was here for your great questions and for your attention. And I hope everyone has a good evening.
Take care, everybody, and please stay in touch.